Hey, my name is Chelsea Fagan, and I'm the founder and CEO of The Financial Diet, a totally independently owned and operated company of women who love to talk about money. Welcome to The Financial Confessions, a weekly show where we talk to people about their personal finances, their professional industry, and how money shapes their lives. You can listen to or watch new episodes of The Financial Confessions every week on YouTube or your preferred streaming platform. You can also support TFD and get exclusive access to our entire catalog of ad-free bonus videos, workshops, Discord community, our book club, and more by joining our members-only community on Patreon or YouTube. Our 2024 goal is to be primarily supported by our incredible community, and joining our membership program is the best way to do that. Enjoy the episode. Welcome back to TFC, and this week we are talking to a really special and unique guest that I personally, for reasons which will quickly become evident, have been very, very excited to talk to. Now, the main crux of our conversation is going to be leaving a toxic work environment. Now, obviously, the person that I'm going to be speaking to comes from a very specific point of view, a very specific industry, which we'll get to, but I know that for most of us, many of us, I'll say most of us, having at some point a toxic work experience is basically par for the course of having a career. I know I've been in toxic work environments, and sometimes for a lot of us, we don't even realize how bad the situation was until we are actually out of it. But one thing that's also pretty fascinating about our guest today is that she is moving full-time into consulting, doing the job that the protagonist in my romance novel does, which I thought was like a fully made up job, cobbled together from several other existing jobs. But it turns out, if you're so inclined, you can actually make that into a real career and get paying clients to do it, which when someone emailed me and was like, hey, I love this book, so I decided to do this job, I was like, skirt, stop the presses, and I knew I had to talk to her. So let's get right into my guest today, Erika Khanna. Hi, Erika.
Hi, Chelsea. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you for being here. So as I teed up in the intro, you are someone who was in a pretty toxic work environment in an industry that I think is rather notorious for some of its not so great work practices. Can you start by contextualizing for our audience kind of the industry you worked in, the job you were doing, and what led you to leave?
Yeah, absolutely. So initially, when I first got out of school, like 10 years ago, I started working in film and advertising. And throughout my career in the creative space, I had my fair share of kind of like toxicity that I dealt with. And I wanted to kind of see myself evolve a little bit more. So I moved into the tech space in 2017. And at that point, I started working for different startups on a more kind of operational basis. And through my experience, I was then hired for a venture capital company that was based in Silicon Valley. And yeah, I honestly didn't go looking for this job. It kind of found me, which I know sounds really strange. And a lot of people are like, how do you maybe get into venture? I'm not the right person to really ask that question, or respond to that question rather. But I found myself being offered this role, and being that I'm Canadian and the role was in the US, a lot of the time Canadians don't really have the opportunity to move to the US to work. So I was like, I'll just try this and see how it goes. And upon moving, my instincts were kind of screaming at me that this might not be the right choice. And I thought that starting the job would maybe have those sentiments change, but they just kind of escalated from there. And I experienced a level of toxicity that, I think not everyone talks about because they're afraid to talk about it. And it led me to achieve a level of clarity around what I'm looking for in how I work with people and what I do, which, for better or for worse, I'm glad that I came to that realization. But yeah, it was a pretty it was a pretty rough time while I was out there.
Can I ask what you were doing work-wise for a venture capital firm?
Yeah, so my background is in marketing and communications, and they were looking for someone who specialized in internal comms, which was sort of like an amalgamation of my experience being operational and communications focused. So my job was to kind of lead the internal communications at that particular company.
Got it. Now, I think Silicon Valley, I think, has such a unique reputation. I mean, I'm someone who loved the show. I might head a rewatch one of these days. Silicon Valley, love that show. I actually recently loved a novel called Ripe that is sort of a dystopian novel about a woman working in a sort of like altered reality Silicon Valley, only slightly so. But either way, I think it's definitely both as a place and as an industry. It is something that has really captured a lot of the pop culture imagination. And I think there was definitely a time, especially, 5 to 10 years ago, where I think the mythos had kind of reached a crescendo in terms of people viewing it as an extremely aspirational work environment. Whereas I think now we're starting to have a little bit more of the conversation. Like I mentioned, that novel Ripe, which came out last year, is extremely critical. And I think there's more just kind of generally a little bit of a disillusionment with the culture that it represents. As someone who worked in the industry at a time when the hype was high, can you talk a little bit about the myth making within Silicon Valley and its own image of itself?
Totally. So, when I moved to Silicon Valley, as I said, I thought, okay, my instincts are, sending me alarm bells, but maybe the penny will drop at some point and I'll just feel this sense of like alignment and flow with the job that I moved there for. And it never happened. And instead, what happened was, as you pointed out, this very strong sense of disillusionment. I mean, I came from a place of working at startups where you kind of jump in, you're very scrappy, but you have a very high level of impact. And when I moved into venture, I didn't really know a lot about venture, honestly. So I was trying to come at it from a place of learning and discovery. And what I learned and discovered very quickly is that people are not very generous with or my experience rather, was that people were not very generous with me with teaching me about the environment that I was in. And it was a very volatile type of place to be in. And it kind of had this sort of Wizard of Odd effect for me, where it was like, oh, I'm seeing behind the veil of how things like decisions get made and really important conversations are had. And I'm actually not as impressed about this as I thought I would be. Instead, I'm actually developing a stronger sense of confidence in myself that I can go out there and do something different because I don't need to necessarily follow the same path as other people that I once admired. And through kind of that discovery, I was also navigating kind of like an intense dynamic with myself and the person that was managing me at the time. And so it really kind of led to this catalyst point of burnout where I was like, I'm burnt out, but not necessarily because I've been working so much. It's just that I just couldn't really wrap my head around contributing to a company that I just felt like I was oil and they were water and we were just like not mixing.
I think what's been interesting about the past 2 years, especially, is I think for a lot of people, myself kind of included, there was always a sense that the mythologizing around a lot of these, industry icons, especially in like tech, venture capital, finance, etc., was a little bit smoke and mirrors and a little bit really good PR. But I think for a lot of people, again, including me, Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, I think, was the first time that a lot of people were like, oh, like, he actually maybe isn't the smartest person in the room, and maybe there isn't a plan, and maybe there isn't like some grand strategy that we just can't see in full yet. Like, this just seems like a guy who's like maybe tweaking on a lot of Adderall and doesn't see his 12 children and is more concerned with like the day-to-day optics of what he's doing than the actual sort of functional result of it, and is very much sort of interested in his own self-aggrandizement and not the particulars of the tech or the business or what have you. And I think Elon Musk is probably the most extreme example, at least that we have public access to, in terms of what's maybe really going on in some of these spaces. However, my husband works in tech, and, there's a humongous amount of crossover with venture capital and all of that, and finance. And for every genuinely really smart, really savvy person in the room, there are also just like a lot of people who were in the right networks and knew the right people and have the right attitude and the right PR about themselves. As someone who saw this up close from kind of both sides, both the firm and the companies the firm is investing in, how often do you feel like the top brass at a lot of these companies was more sort of hype than actual substance?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a very bang on kind of take. So and this also goes back to like my days working in film and advertising too. Like a lot of the time you're working for really big clients, and typically the bigger the client or the more kind of famous or popular they are, the more you have these sort of like hype people that surround them. And it takes a lot of work to kind of funnel through the bullshit a lot of the time to figure out what the actual work is that needs to get done. And once you get to that kind of aspect of it, it's less impressive than you would think. And my time in venture was not dissimilar to that. I was there for a very short time, but I saw that very quickly. I had worked in tech obviously before that, and I knew that aspects of this existed. I think when it comes to venture as an industry, there's definitely these aspects of hype that exist within the confines of that. We see that a lot with different startups that get built really, really quickly, and then they crash really, really quickly as well. And I think that's something that I encountered a lot in my experience, where I worked with a lot of people who were very into the optics of things, and a lot of the time, the work that I was particularly doing was on building out those optics more than the actual substance of what I would have wanted to learn or be challenged by. And we talk about a toxic work environment. I think you end up spending a lot of your time, no matter what the industry is, on building into these dynamics of power and control and optics and politics that exist within the company, instead of actually focusing on the actual work, which is what in turn ends up like burning people out and having people go into these existential crises of like, do I actually enjoy what I do? Do I want to do something different? And all of that.
Well, one thing that's really notable about Silicon Valley as kind of a culture is how extraordinarily male dominated it is on kind of every level. And again, I think like Elon Musk is such an interesting example of like a figurehead in the sense that like, yeah, he's probably a really extreme case where he literally has like a dozen children by all these different women and like isn't, as far as anyone can tell, spending any time with them, or like I think several of them have already like been estranged from him. And like, anyway, point being, like his personal life is obviously in a degree of shambles that like if he weren't the richest man on the planet or whatever, like I think people would have a very different view of it. But I think that entire culture of kind of disregarding the work that needs to happen at home, or, if there are children, who needs to be raising them, like just the entire sort of humanity side of the people in the workplace, and especially the domestic labor, like in these industries, it seems pretty much the norm that is totally disregarded. I think in part because the majority of decision makers and employees are men. So they're automatically a lot less affected by it, and also exist in a culture where they're not expected to be that present in their personal lives. And I've heard from a lot of women who work in tech, finance, et cetera, that, for example, like having a child can be an enormous liability for your career. I actually know a person who successfully sued their former employer over a similar situation. But all of that is to say, I mean, being in that situation, not only as a woman, but as someone who wasn't even a US citizen, can you talk about that specific dynamic of needing to kind of downplay or neglect your personal life?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I I don't want to say I was lucky enough to work with mostly women on the team because some of the people that I met were people that I honestly don't really want to work with ever again. But at the same time, I didn't see as much of like the blatant, possibly like sexism that exists on more of like maybe the actual investor side of things than on the operational side of things, which is where I was working. So I guess in that regard, I was fairly lucky. But at the same time, as far as it went for my personal life, I had no personal life whatsoever being in that environment. And, I don't think this is even exclusionary to venture or to tech. When I worked in film, I was a production assistant and I worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week most of the time. And it was heavily normalized that like that was just the way it was in the industry. And I think since my time there, production assistants have been unionized and like a lot of other things have happened, which I think is really great. But I think this is very, very prevalent in a lot of ways where when you're on the operational side of a business, women tend to be the majority in those moments. And what's also interesting is you're sort of this catch-all for everybody else's needs, and including the needs of potentially, whether that's like a toxic boss or manager or whoever it is that you're working with. And so my time in venture specifically, kind of mirrored my time as a production assistant in many ways, where I was working most of the day, if not the entire day. And the expectations were that you would just kind of get on with it. I distinctly remember like my first week moving into the US and starting work. I was super excited. Obviously, you're kind of on this adrenaline high of like, you're kind of in this new place and trying to get your bearings. And the first weekend after my work week, I was like, okay, I'm going to, run a bunch of errands and try and furnish my apartment and all these things that you need to do. And my phone just would not stop going off. And I had so many Slack messages. And in my head, I was like, okay, I want to set a precedence that I'm not super responsive over the weekends to sort of like guard my time a little bit more. And, I tried to do that as much as possible. And then it was like Sunday evening and I checked my phone and I had 67 missed Slack messages. And some of them were really, pointed that I hadn't responded in a very short amount of time. And I realized very quickly that, the approach I was trying to instill within my work and life was just like not going to work. And I thought it was kind of interesting too, because obviously they're very well aware that I had moved, and I needed just certain life admin things to get done, such as like getting a driver's license or, a social security number. And the office hours of those places are the same as like the office hours of most businesses. And so it kind of felt like this game of Jenga of like, okay, maybe on Friday afternoon, I can like potentially swing going to the DMV if this happens. And, it was just like very, very stressful and very obvious to me that I was going to have to navigate these very intense power dynamics from the very beginning. And that was something that I had a hard time trying to like justify.
Well, to that point, I mean, getting 67 Slack messages over the weekend, like your first week working in a new office, like I think even for people who are willing to tolerate a lot, I think that would send up anyone's red flag in terms of this workplace not being super accommodating or even having basic boundaries. But I think a lot of people, because we hear from a lot of people who are in a work environment that doesn't suit them, that they don't like. And, obviously, eventually, for anyone who's in that position, the long game has to be find a different job. But, we want to acknowledge that that's not always super easy. And also, for some people, there are certain aspects of the job that they do like. For example, it might be a job that pays them more than other jobs would pay them or has other perks or benefits. So we often have people who are essentially asking some version of how can I improve the situation before I officially decide I have to pull the plug. And I'm interested, before you left the job and, found something that suited you better, how long did you sort of try to make it work, and what strategies did you implement to try and make it work? And then I guess finally, like, what was the cue to you that like, oh, this is just not going to get better?
Yeah. So I totally empathize with anyone who's out there right now who feels like they're in an environment that is not working for them. It's such an awful feeling because you spend so much time working. And, when I was in this environment, it was kind of this weird, very immediate feeling that I knew I wasn't going to be there for very long. They often, in many different types of ways, would talk about how there was a revolving door of a lot of employees and that people left very frequently. And so I kind of had it in my head that I was like, okay, I'll give this a year and see where this goes. And then a couple of weeks in of me kind of trying to navigate these dynamics that I, again, was just like, feeling like I was constantly put in a position to lose in. It didn't feel like this organic flow of conversation with almost anyone that I met. Like almost everyone that I was speaking with or working with had this like kind of personal or professional agenda that they were trying to push. And it was one that I realized was like, okay, if I don't play this same game as other people, I don't think I'm going to survive in this environment. And even if I try, is that really authentic to me and something I want to spend my time doing? Like, I came here to work. I didn't necessarily come here to like be in this weird reality show type of environment. And so I mean, I think like more tactically, if you're in this position where you're considering leaving, I think the first thing to think about is number one, like, is it a chronic kind of thing where you're experiencing this level of kind of like discomfort or like power dynamics or whatever the case is with your boss on like a day-to-day level that's like constant and always happening? Or is this new and is it something that could potentially change? I mean, a lot of companies right now are restructuring a lot, and a lot of dynamics could easily change in a very short amount of time. And so I think asking yourself that question is really important. That's something I asked myself at that point in time. And what I realized was sort of like step two to this sort of process was I was working with someone who was very solid in the company that I was at. And so I didn't really forecast this changing anytime soon for myself. And so similarly, if you're working with someone who is kind of like a lifer and has been at the company for 15 years or 5 years or whatever it is, and you don't necessarily see the dynamic changing because maybe they're really tight with the C-level people that you work with, or maybe they just have like a very strong professional network in your workplace, and so it's really hard for you to kind of like communicate with other people in your space because you don't feel necessarily safe to do that. Like, all of these things kind of factor in. And then the other thing I would say is like, is there an opportunity for you to move laterally within your own company if you're fearful of leaving your job based on the job market right now? So, obviously, as we know, there have been like many layoffs across many different industries over the last 2 years. Specifically, if you're working in any corporate job, it can feel really daunting to leave your job if you don't have anything else lined up. So I think like following this kind of formula helps in making a decision. And if you're finding that your mental health is suffering, your career development is suffering, then to me, those are like two pillars that should always be on the more positive end of things in any environment, work or otherwise. And so, I think going through this sort of like decision process is what led me to realize, okay, is this something that could change and, or is this something that's going to stay the same? And where I realized things were going to stay the same was when I started to really see through that the person that I was supposed to go to for support and leadership and mentorship was actually the person that was actively kind of campaigning for my demise in many ways. And so I think if you're experiencing this, it might be that you're working with a colleague or a manager who very obviously doesn't believe in your success and purposefully puts you in positions where you're not going to be successful. And that's really hard because as someone who cares about your work, it's like you want to make a good impression. You want to contribute in a really impactful way. So you end up spinning your wheels on all these things and spending so much time and energy on this that like you don't really have the energy to apply for jobs outside of that necessarily. And that can be really hard. And to me, that was very much the catalyst of like, okay, this isn't going to work out. And so I need to figure out an exit plan. And that's when I started to like make a lot of phone calls to my parents and like other friends of mine. And basically was just looking for support as to like, I want to make this decision, but I haven't been here for very long. what do I do? And I already had the answer. I think I was just really looking for someone to tell me to pull the plug.
I want to take a second to thank this episode's sponsor, Delete Me. I've shared it before, but I have been on a big journey this year to change a few of my habits, and notably one of them is how I use the internet. After much nagging for many years from my husband, who not only works in tech, but for a long time specifically worked in data security, after years of him nagging me that my password hygiene was deplorable, I finally got better about managing my passwords and making sure that everything was really safe on that front, especially after my Twitter got hacked. But I've also been really conscientious and working with Delete Me to make sure that my data is removed from everywhere on the internet that I don't want it to be. And it's not just for me, who's a public figure who has data everywhere, it's probably true of most of you. That's why I personally recommend and actually use Delete Me. You don't realize how much of your information is available to scammers and people with ill intent on the internet, and unfortunately how susceptible you and your family are to identity theft and fraud. But now you can get your data removed with Delete Me. Delete Me is a subscription service that removes your personal info from the largest people search databases on the web, and in the process helps prevent identity theft, doxing, and phishing scams. Delete Me finds and removes the personal information you don't want online, and makes sure it stays off. Sign up and provide Delete Me with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts will take it from there. Delete Me sends you regular personalized privacy reports showing what they found, where they found it, and what they removed. Delete Me isn't just a one-time service. They're always working for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you don't want on the internet. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/TFC and use promo code TFC at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/TFC and enter code TFC at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/TFC, code TFC. How long had you been at the company before you finally left?
I was only there for like 3 months, but I really did not have a good time in that 3 months.
Were you concerned about the impact that having such a short stay would have on your resume?
Totally. I mean, like I had been at jobs before this for like about a year or 2 years, and I was really hoping to be in something that I could see through for the long term, because I was really kind of like in my early 20s and in the earlier part of my career. I purposely job hopped because I wanted to learn a lot about a lot of different industries, and I wanted to learn about a lot of different facets of those industries. And so when I got to a point in my 30s where I was like, okay, I actually want to see some longevity, and now I have an opportunity to potentially do that, it was really heartbreaking when I was like realizing that this opportunity was going to be another short-lived experience. And not only was it going to be short-lived, it was going to be like so short to the point where I would potentially have a hard time like justifying that to any future employer. And, you know, I think what I started to realize was it takes a lot of bravery to leave a situation that you know isn't right for you. It also takes a lot of bravery to move to a different country. And it takes a lot of skill to be able to navigate a lot of the things that I worked on and the environment that I was in. And so I started to regain a little bit of a sense of confidence, and found a way to talk about those things within like a job interview kind of context. And I also realized like what kind of work I wanted to start doing and what kind of work I wanted to stay away from in order for me to maintain just like a healthier overall life.
So does that mean you were only actually living in the US for 3 months?
I was living in the US for about 4 months from end to end. I had moved about like 2 or 3 weeks before I started working. And then, and then I left. I was there from August until about the end of October was like my timeline.
I must imagine that there were some mixed emotions about that as well, because it's, you know, not just the job not working out, it's the entire move to Northern California.
Absolutely. I mean, when I first got this job, I had actually already moved. I was in Montreal, which is where I'm originally from, and I had moved apartments because the job that I had before this opportunity came up, everything was going really, really well, and I was on path to be promoted, and I was super excited. And unfortunately, as we've seen with the market crashed, and a lot of people at the company that I was at ended up losing their jobs, and myself included. And so when I moved into my new place, I moved with this feeling of like, okay, I should get a job like quite quickly. And when this role came up and it was based in Silicon Valley, I initially honestly did it as like a bit to myself and my friends. I was like, how funny is this that like this has come up? I don't think they're going to go for me because there's a lot of hoops to jump through. And, a lot of people who get hired in venture come from environments where they're like from Ivy League schools or have worked at like a big four consulting firm. And I have none of those experiences. So it was really interesting to me when this actually became serious. And I was like, oh my God, I'm moving to California now and I have to sell all my stuff and get a visa and do this all within like a month. And so life changed really quickly. And, I think part of that probably played into my level of tolerance of how much I could take within a very high octane work environment. So, I think I was feeling aspects of burnout as I was also trying to navigate some of these dynamics too. And as I was leaving California, honestly, it kind of felt like I just needed like a rescue helicopter to jump in and like airlift me out. I wasn't really paying too much attention to anything other than just like getting home and trying to recuperate from about like a few months worth of ups and downs at that point.
It's a shame. It's one of the most beautiful places on planet Earth, just geographically.
I know. And what was so funny to me too was like, so a childhood friend of mine was doing his medical residency in Silicon Valley at the same time. And so it was actually really nice because I got a chance to spend some time with him when he was there too. And both of us were having kind of similar experiences. And so he would say to me, everyone in my residency program is saying how much like this is the most beautiful place on earth, and yet here we are having like the worst times possible. And it took a lot for me to even just go back to San Francisco in general. I had to go out there for a work trip earlier this year, and I felt this very kind of visceral reaction to landing in SFO. And, I was really glad to have had a more positive experience this time around. I was only there for about a week, and it was obviously, something that I had to go in and do for a few days and kind of come home. And so I was able to soak up the more positive aspects of being there. Like, yeah, it is beautiful. It's gorgeous. And it's just a shame. I never really got to see any of it because I was working pretty much the entire time.
And as I mentioned in the intro, you have sort of pivoted your life to being a kind of hotel branding, styling consultant. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So when I moved home after this kind of saga, I really just needed a lot of downtime. I just needed like a moment to come down from a lot of the experiences that I've had and realign some of the things that brought me a lot of joy and focus more on that instead of focusing on the things that were really kind of bringing me down. And I'm very lucky that I was able to go home and live with my parents for a bit, because obviously like when you're in your early to mid 30s, the last thing you want to do is have to do that. But like, I am glad that I did have that time. And my dad has owned and operated a restaurant in Montreal for over 35 years. And so restaurants have always been a part of the conversation in my family. And so I was trying to focus on, the things that were more positive, which at that time I would go into my dad's restaurant and I would do some work from like his office and taste some food in the kitchen, or he would come home and we would cook together for a little bit. And it just started to really kind of heal my relationship with myself a lot more. And I started to realize that what I was also doing was providing suggestions on things like menu development or helping them with like interior design decisions and things that were just more creative and didn't really feel like a job necessarily at that time. And as I started doing that, I was like, wait, people do actually do this as a job, and this could be really interesting. And so I started to look into this industry a little bit more. And I started doing what I know how to do within this space, which is content and writing and comms and operations. And so I started interviewing different chefs, and I created a newsletter called Daughter of a Restaurateur, where I basically was writing editorial pieces about different chefs and restaurateurs and entrepreneurs. And it started to evolve a little bit. And then, around that time was when your book was published, and it arrived on my doorstep kind of just in time, really. And in reading it, I was like so inspired, and also was like, similarly to what you mentioned earlier in the episode, I was like, wait, this could be a job if I wanted it to be a job. And so I just thought, like, why not try to see if I can get a few clients and use the experience that I've had working at startups and working for different marketing agencies, and use this in kind of this way. And so right now I do work full time, but in my spare time, I also consult for hospitality venues and hotels, restaurants, different people even who are in the industry. So yeah.
Do you feel like, in some ways, having had such a profoundly negative work experience made you more primed to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, when I got to Silicon Valley, I initially wanted to be really impressed by the sort of like big company facade that we see and hear about in shows like Silicon Valley, and from different people that maybe we know who work at these larger organizations that have products that we use every day. And I really felt this hopefulness when I got there, and what I experienced was just like this void that I just knew I didn't belong there. And so in some ways it was sort of like a realignment of choices and in my own kind of life trajectory by a process of elimination, of being like, okay, big red X on that experience and on this place. I don't want to work in this environment, but what I do want to do is work in a more creative capacity. And so, I wanted to be able to do that initially, kind of more slowly. Like, I didn't want to make any larger changes right off the bat. I had obviously gone through a lot of change, and I was very lucky enough to land a full-time job very shortly after my time there. So I was kind of like, okay, how can I use some of the resources and skills that I'm building at work, and kind of start to funnel them in this direction a little bit more? And that's what I started to do.
What would your advice be to someone who is feeling like it may not even just be the job, it may be their entire industry or profession that isn't right for them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think my advice would first be, ask yourself what you really believe in as far as like what your personal values are. I had a hard time defining what those were at a few moments in my life. And when I think I kind of go by feeling a lot of the time. And so it's like, if I'm in a situation and it feels really wrong, I have to really sit down with myself and ask myself why. And through that process, kind of develop a sense of like more like a moral compass and a personal kind of value structure that helps me make decisions. And so I think that's kind of like the first step in that situation. And through those things, what I would say is like, also ask yourself, is there a way for you to make a change in more of like an easygoing kind of way, so that you don't have to drop everything and then move into a new space right away? One thing that I did a lot in my 20s was like pivot really hard from industry to industry. And it was a bit challenging. I mean, it does get to a point where you're like, I know what I'm talking about, but I feel like I need to know more about something. And so I think really kind of giving yourself the time to learn and to soak up as much as you possibly can about a new industry is super important, because you might discover things that you didn't know that you don't really like about it. And so I think, have conversations with people who work in that space, who are doing similar things to what you would envision or would like to do, and see what their day-to-day experiences are like, and ask yourself if that's something that aligns with, what your thoughts are in wanting to change. And then the next thing is like, I think give yourself as much personal financial runway as you possibly can. I think we tend to glamorize this sense of like throwing caution to the wind and like making these big, bold choices. And I totally condone those. I think, they can really change your life in a really positive way. And also they can totally blow up your life in a really negative way. And I experienced that pretty firsthand last year. And so I think, giving yourself that time is very priceless, because you'll be able to, discover more, spend some potential like time and money on like certifications if you need them, or you might even just like spend some time and money traveling to kind of get a new perspective and do that sort of thing. So financial runway is kind of crucial. And I feel like it's easy to gloss over that and not talk about that, but that's kind of one of the key parts of this. And then from there, what I would say is like, what is the thing that when you wake up in the morning, you're going to know is hard, but that you're going to choose it anyway? Because your job is never going to be awesome 100% of the time. But if it sucks like 75% of the time, then I would say like, yeah, it's time for a change and it's time for you to start asking some questions. My general kind of balance that I strive for is I should love doing what I'm doing at least 60% of the time. And I should at least feel a level of challenge that makes me question it a little bit so that I keep that level of motivation for myself. And that's like personal to me and it might be different for other people, but that's kind of the way that I would structure my decision making for any kind of really big life change that you would want to make, be that like moving to a new country or a new industry or whatever.
It cannot be overstated how much the bias of familiarity and comfort keeps people in all kinds of situations that aren't right for them. I mean, I think so many people are in, it could be a job, it could be a relationship, it could be a city that like they have long since outgrown or doesn't serve them. But it's really scary to change, and it's really easy to stay in a situation even if you don't like it. And in some ways, being in a bad dynamic can itself become kind of addictive. I remember when I was at a really bad job, like bitching with my coworkers after work was like one of my favorite activities. I could do that forever. And it wasn't until I got out that I was like, man, we all needed a better outlet for our time. What a waste. But it becomes, a bonding activity. It becomes a sense of identity. And I always say we had a workshop this past month for our members, or this month, about earning more at any job. And one of the key kind of takeaways is you should always be looking for a job when you don't need one, not when you do, because you never want to be in the position of scrambling. But also when you are employed and you have options, you have infinitely more leverage at your own job, at a potential new job. And I think if more people got into the habit of just always kind of having their ear to the ground, making sure their resume and everything and personal website are updated, maybe speaking with a headhunter, networking, etc., like they would just be in such a better position to have all their options and also not feel like they can't imagine a situation other than the one that they're in.
Totally. I think the thing that's really hard too is like when you are in a toxic work environment, a lot of the time you have like zero energy level to job hunt after the day is done. It's just like I spent so much time navigating social dynamics. The last thing I want to do is like hop on my laptop and like figure out what my resume looks like. It's just like the most draining kind of activity. And so I think, speaking to people who would want to maybe make a change because they're really not happy with where they're at because something is really toxic, what I would say is like, first, if there's a way for you to maybe pivot within your company, because it could also be that like you're working with a team that is just like not a team that you really like to work with. And maybe within the same organization, you could pivot and it might make it a little bit better. That's like the first thing that I would kind of look out for so that you're not putting yourself in a position where you are scrambling. And the second thing is like, if you are also like looking to make a change pretty much immediately, ask yourself, like, if the plug was pulled tomorrow and you weren't getting paid at all anymore, would you feel okay about that? Or would it kind of pile on more stress to what you already are currently living through? And if the answer to that is like really, terrifying, then I think it's a really great time to take a calculated risk where you're like, okay, maybe it's a question of toughing this out for like 3 months or 6 months, and then at that point, making a change that will better serve me. And sometimes, making those decisions can really empower us to feel even better, or not even better, but just a little bit better about the current state of things. Because often when we're talking about things like burnout or toxic work environments or toxic people that we work with, like it all has to do with this dynamic of power and control and of like agency and feeling like you have none. And so when you personally make some of these like choices in a more internal way where you can show up to work and know that, 3 months from now, you're not going to have to deal with like Jack at work who's like such a dick. Like it kind of helps you get a little bit more into the weeds of like, okay, what can I accomplish here that's going to actually impress people after I leave or serve me better in my next opportunity. So I think those things are also, things to think about whenever you're looking to make a change, especially if it's, related to you wanting to get away from an environment or people that are really not serving you at all anymore.
Well, Erika, thank you so much for coming on and sharing not only your, I think, very relatable story, but also the light at the end of the tunnel for being in a really bad situation. So if people want to learn more about the work that you do as a consultant, where should they go?
Yeah, so they can check out my website. It's commissionstudio.net. And I'm a .net person now, I guess. I was trying to find the .com, but didn't find it or wasn't able to get it. And I'm also at daughter of a restaurateur on TikTok and Instagram. And my newsletter is also called Daughter of a Restaurateur.
Out of curiosity, what's your dad's restaurant in Montreal?
So funnily enough, it's called L'Usine de Spaghetti, which like translates to the spaghetti factory. It's not actually one of the franchise spaghetti factories, but it was built in 1987, and it's like an Italian and like French bistro in Old Montreal.
Oh, how interesting. Is there also a chain called that?
Yeah, so there's a spaghetti factory chain in the US, and it's not at all the same restaurant or type of restaurant. But I remember going to San Diego on a work trip, and my boss at the time was like, "Oh, let's go to the spaghetti factory," and I was like, "What?" And yeah, it's kind of like it's a franchised Italian restaurant, kind of like Olive Garden, I guess. But my dad's restaurant is a little bit more refined.
That's hilarious. I suppose we never had one where I was growing up. We were more of a macaroni grill type place. Similar vibe in name and food, I'm sure. Thank you again, Erika, for joining us, and thank you all at home for tuning in. And we will see you back here next Monday on an all new episode of The Financial Confessions. Bye. Thank you so much for joining us, and be sure to tune in next week for an all-new episode of The Financial Confessions. The Financial Confessions is created by The Financial Diet and hosted by me, Chelsea Fagan. It is produced by Alexa Brooks-Major and Holly Trantham. Recording and editing by Emily Fisher, and music and sound effects are from Epidemic Sound. Want more of our content? Head over to our YouTube page, The Financial Diet, to see our monthly deep dives, videos of this show, and our entire backlog of videos and podcasts. I'll talk to you next week.